Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza, and today we're going to be talking about an upcoming vital decision that will have the power to shape one of the largest criminal legal systems in the world. We're talking about California. So this decision centers on Governor Gavin Newsom's choice for California's next Attorney General. State attorneys general play an incredibly important role in representing states' residents on issues like civil rights, the death penalty, toxic environmental crimes, voter protection cases. It's a huge job, and it really matters to ordinary people. So California's attorney general has historically been an especially high-profile position. You have probably heard of a former California attorney general. I believe her name is, what is it again? Oh, Vice President Kamala Harris. So the state's current attorney general, Xavier Becerra, is likely departing to become President Joe Biden's next Health and Human Services Secretary. That leaves his job open in California. Governor Newsom is soon going to be tasked with selecting a replacement. That replacement is going to have to represent more than 40 million California residents. And there have been a number of names circulating for this job, potential candidates. But there's one name in particular that's setting off some alarm bells among Californians, and that name is Adam Schiff. Now, for many of you, the name Adam Schiff probably evokes warm fuzzies rather than alarm bells. You may be familiar with him as a California congressman who led the House's first impeachment effort against then-President Donald Trump. That was in early 2020. But to understand why Californians are so troubled by the possibility of Schiff as their next attorney general, we have to go back actually further than that. Prepare your brain to go into deep pre-pandemic time. It's only really 10 years ago. So Schiff's rise to prominence began with a position as an assistant United States attorney in Southern and Central California, where he prosecuted a number of high-profile cases involving fraud, corruption, espionage. In 1996, Schiff left his career as a prosecutor for the California State Senate. He spent only one term there before successfully running for U.S. Congress. But it was a busy 4 years for Schiff, in large part due to his prolific efforts to push tough on crime policies in the state legislature. As USC professor Jody Armour details in a recent piece for The Appeal, and I'll quote him here, Schiff authored over 24 bills to directly increase the reach and punitiveness of the criminal legal system, including bills to allow children as young as 14 to be tried as an adult, to expand California's notoriously racist three strikes law, and make hiring unauthorized aliens a crime that could land a person in prison for 4 years. Armour's among a group of 40 racial justice leaders and organizations who recently penned an open letter to Governor Newsom, asking them to select someone other than Schiff as Attorney General. The group notes that Schiff's punitive streak has continued throughout his career in the U.S. Congress. In 2017, for example, Schiff sided with Republicans against most House Democrats, as well as against prominent civil rights groups and racial justice groups, when he supported a thin blue line bill, which was a failed piece of legislation that sought to expand the use of the federal death penalty. So California is in this moment where they're in the middle of transforming their criminal justice policy, and that makes Schiff's outlook here especially a high contrast with many of the state's voters, who in recent years have seemed to want to move away from the state's tough on crime legacy, a legacy that Schiff himself has clearly helped create. With California really only just beginning the work of dismantling mass incarceration, rooting out racial injustice, creating real community safety, Schiff's critics say that he would be a real threat to all of that progress. So now, here to talk with us about Schiff's record and the importance of the role of the California Attorney General, I am so thrilled and honored to be joined by Professor Jody Armour himself, the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California, and the author of that recent piece for The Appeal, as well as many other things. Thank you, Professor, so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So before we get into the issues about Adam Schiff and his record, I want to drill down with you for a second on why the California Attorney General in particular is such an important position. Can you explain the role that California's AG plays in representing the state's residents in court, but also in guiding the direction of policy and the criminal legal system more broadly?
Yeah, the California Attorney General not only enforces civil rights laws, a lot of other laws that have a direct impact on people's lives, but he or she, in this case, he also has responsibility under the California system that is different than many other states of actually bringing investigations into police departments for patterns or practices of discrimination, discriminatory policing. California led the nation in 2000 in giving its attorney general that kind of investigative power to go in and root out corruption in police departments. You normally had to wait for the federal DOJ to step in, right? And enter, as we did with the LAPD, when we entered a consent decree between the LAPD and a federal justice and the federal Department of Justice. Here in California, we give that power to the Attorney General too. So this Attorney General is critical in holding police departments accountable. We've even given them the power to bring prosecutions on the basis of police shootings. Even more recently, the Attorney General to go into police departments and do that. So the Attorney General in California is uniquely situated to enhance the credibility, the moral legitimacy, the trust and confidence of the population, of the people of California in law enforcement, because he or she, in this case, he is the top law enforcement, officer. They are the top cop. And so their policies are critical at this moment in which we are saying we're moving away from failed approaches to blame and punishment rooted in retribution, retaliation, and revenge, and saying there's a new vision now that the voters are getting behind, rooted in restoration, redemption, and rehabilitation.
So I want to dig in for a second. I have this feeling that you and I could go down like a policing rabbit hole and stay there for like 4 hours, but we're going to not do that. But I did want to drill down just for a second. I mean, for those folks who don't closely follow California, I mean, obviously this issue has been at the forefront with gangs in the sheriff's division in Los Angeles. I don't mean the sheriffing or policing gangs. I mean actual like sheriffs being in gangs. And also with the fight happening over George Gascon's desire to implement new policy in the DA's office. What's the AG's role been in those big high-profile fights?
Well, the AG is supposed to step in and hold, for example, corrupt DAs accountable. If we're talking about a DA's office like George Gascon or Chesa Boudin up in San Francisco, there have been no allegations of any such corruption, but that is the kind of thing that the AG does, make sure that prosecutors are held to account. And often they've been criticized for not being more active in that respect. And so that's one way they could certainly play a role, as well as launch investigations. Like I said, California has given AGs unique investigatory tools, powers, subpoena powers, all the rest to go in and look at police departments, sheriff's departments, and the like, and root out corruption through entering consent decrees and the like that make them just a critically important part of any criminal justice reform.
So let's turn to Adam Schiff's record for a second. Going back to his time as a state senator in California, can you give us a rundown of like the kinds of legislation that he championed while in office that you find concerning?
Yeah, he's especially punitive when it comes to juveniles. You see a lot of his bills over and over again targeting juveniles for special kind of treatment. He wanted to allow children 14 years or older accused of serious crimes to be tried as an adult at the sole discretion of the prosecutor without a fitness hearing by the judge, right? So we already have prosecutors who have a punitive mindset, and they're going to determine whether this 14-year-old is going to be blamed and punished as someone who has the brain development of, someone 30 or 40 as an adult. We already know brains are, don't really fully get there in many of us until we're 25. So 14, and he was just leading the charge in a whole wave of kinds of bills. You've already mentioned some of them, taking power away from juries to make factual findings about priors, right? So that would increase the ease with which people could be sentenced to lengthy periods of incarceration based on, kinds of violations that weren't proven to a jury satisfaction. massive expansion of the length of sentences by removing the 5-year sentence cap for enhancements for nonviolent offenses. That was SB 1900. He wanted to expand the power of a juvenile court to issue orders preventing a parent, relative, or guardian of a child from visiting their own child, and to terminate custodial rights. He wanted to expand the application of 3 strikes laws and make it easier for prosecutors to obtain convictions. That's SB 786. I could go down a long laundry list. They're all going to land on the same kind of theme, and that is viewing social problems as criminal justice issues and trying to solve them through punitive interventions on disproportionately communities of color. Because he knew as a former prosecutor that these laws were disproportionately going to fall on those communities, and yet he was a strong champion of them.
Yeah, I wanted actually, there's another theme that sort of occurred to me as you were going through those, and I'm glad my face wasn't on screen because I had this really horrified expression on my face, but it feels like a lot of those initiatives were designed to consolidate power unilaterally with the prosecutor. I mean, as we know, ideally we have a system where different actors in the legal system kind of check each other. And pretty much every bill you just mentioned was a bill to take away those checks, to let prosecutors decide if a child should be tried as an adult without anybody checking them on that, to let them blow up sentences without anybody checking on that. It seems like that really relates heavily to becoming the top prosecutor in the state.
Yeah, it suggests the kinds of reflexes, the kinds of instincts that he has, right? That right now at this moment, when we've had the voters of LA for sure, who ousted Jackie Lacey, who was a more traditional law and order DA, as you pointed out, going in, the kind that Adam Schiff would have embraced in the past, that kind of DA has been rejected by the voters of LA in favor of George Gascon, a progressive prosecutor alternative that ran on a progressive prosecution platform, campaign platform. Chesa Boudin up north in the same way. So the voters are saying that the Overton window on blame and justice matters has shifted. Right now, the kinds of policies that Adam Schiff was historically supporting, and then we can get to his more recent support that suggests he hasn't changed his ways with the Thin Blue Line Act and the like, that his attitude is a relic of, but not completely behind us relic, of a bygone era of tough on crime. We're going to use, the hammer of criminal justice to solve every social problem, and we're going to be as punitive as possible. We have realized that has led to nothing but disaster for communities of color, for Black communities, for poor communities. And so now he is representing that old moral framework, that old moral compass, and to bring him in now as the Attorney General and say, you are to preside over all of these cities like LA and San Francisco and many others in which the voters are saying, we want a new conception of justice, not the old one, rooted in retribution, retaliation, revenge that you're associated with, but one rooted in restoration, rehabilitation, and redemption. And that's why I think this is so crucial at this time for this governor to recognize what the voters really want by way of change and bring in an attorney general that's going to promote change rather than resist it.
So I'm going to dive into his more recent record in a second. But before we do, I just wanted to ask, I know a lot of his bills that he proposed way back in the day didn't pass. And I'm wondering, we all remember that like California in the 1990s was a tough on crime state, and that's how the criminal legal system got so bloated and out of control in California. But was he out of step even for that time?
Even for that time, yes. That's the thing. Even for that time, he was on the draconian edge, right? And had to be reined in by some other people who also had some draconian impulses, but he was too draconian even for them to get behind him and support some of the measures that he was advancing, right? So that in criminal justice matters, it's important to recognize Adam Schiff as really an extremist. I hate to use that language, but he's at the extreme end, and that's why I'm so alarmed. No one's perfect. No candidate is going to be perfect. I could also have issues with any other candidate, but this one is unique, right? You can take, there are costs and benefits. You can work with certain things with other candidates, but he is unique in the role that he's played and being at the vanguard of our most punitive, retributive urges and instincts in criminal justice matters.
I will note it's the first time I've heard on the Appeal Live someone apologizing for using Latin legal terminology in extremis as if they were using curse words. So thank you for the extra polite cover on that. All right, let's move to his congressional record. Did he shake that draconian style? What happened when he got to the U.S. Congress?
Yeah, well, he started getting behind in 2017, for example. He was one of a minority, only 40-something, maybe 48 at the most, Democrats who supported this Thin Blue Line Act, which was just a piece of theater that said we are going to add the status of a victim as a member of law enforcement as an aggravating factor that a jury could consider in determining whether someone is death worthy, right? And you don't need to add that aggravating factor. There's already an aggravating factor in the number of enumerated aggravating factors that refers to law enforcement status. It's already there. There are a number of other aggravating factors that would also cover law enforcement. So this wasn't providing law enforcement personnel with any added protection or being even necessarily more retributive or punitive towards anyone who injured law enforcement. Rather, it was a piece of theater that was being carried on in 2016 and 17, in which people were saying Black Lives Matter movement has gotten too much traction. You know, they made too many inroads. We need to push back. And one way we're going to push back is by creating additional kinds of symbols of support for law enforcement and saying that that's where, we're really standing. Now, I'm not saying you can't be supportive of law enforcement. You can, and many of us are. I belong myself to a law enforcement agency, Law Enforcement Action Partnership of current and former chiefs of police, lieutenants, right down to rank and file, who are very much concerned about the issues we're talking about and looking for good solutions. So, being supportive of law enforcement is one thing, but feeding and fueling a kind of rhetorical campaign aimed at Black Lives Matter and at activists, and using, the Thin Blue Line Act as your cover, and still only being an extremist again, still only getting, a minority of other Democrats to support that same act because they could all see what it was. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say his instincts are still very pro-carceral, pro-law and order.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about another side of his instincts because, building up the sort of pro-carceral law enforcement side of it is certainly we see with the Thin Blue Line Act. But I wanted to check in with you also about in 2009, 2010, he brought HR 1022, which was the Gang Prevention, Intervention, and Suppression Act. And as, full disclosure, as I've written about, as I know you've spoken about, the way gang policing and gang enforcement actually plays out in communities of color is very much, is oftentimes more related to hyper surveillance of ordinary Black and brown men, starting in childhood. With repeated police contact, the kind of police contact that can be traumatizing and destructive and really, really tear apart communities of color. I'm wondering if you can talk for a second about the perspective that you see in someone bringing an act that heightens that impact on Black and brown communities.
Yeah, the gang databases are notoriously riddled with error and bias, so much so that here in LA, in the metropolitan gang, the elite metropolitan unit of the LAPD was busted for cooking the books on their gang numbers and putting people in the gang database that didn't belong there and they knew didn't belong there. And, we'll see what the real repercussions are. They'll probably, get, some paid vacation time. And come back, but there haven't been a lot more serious ripples from that. But what it did cast a cloud on is the reliability of any of these gang databases. You can wind up on them so easily that in the neighborhood I live in here in South Central, LA, I can walk down the street and just kick it with some guys on the corner, and I'm associating with known gang members according to them, and now Armour's in the gang database, you know. So it's so easy to get in these, and judges have recognized that they're deeply flawed, and so therefore to use them as an instrument of policy to try to impose some kind of order of justice in these Black and brown communities is just obtuse, really, kind of morally obtuse and kind of insensitive to the realities on the street here in LA.
Obtuse is a phrase I'm going to carry with me and lob at people for quite some time. So let's talk. You mentioned the Jackie Lacey, George Gascon race a minute ago. For folks who somehow did not follow that, we had Jackie Lacey, the incumbent, more of a regressive model of prosecutor, and then George Gascon, the challenger, running on a very dramatic, I mean, in many ways, strong reform ticket. Obviously, there's always ways in which we could push somebody to go stronger, but that was the perception, it seemed, at the time. So Schiff initially endorsed Jackie Lacey. A lot of people did at the very beginning. I remember a lot of people endorsed Jackie Lacey. And then Schiff, you know, as the summer went on, as protests continued, as the disparate racial impact of Lacey's policies was more prominent in the media, he did, like many other people, withdraw his support for Jackie Lacey. But unlike many other people, Schiff did not then endorse George Gascon. I'm wondering if you could talk about what this says about his perspective on reform and on the shifting landscape in California, and how that could play out if he were to become AG.
Yeah, I think it indicates what a shape-shifting chameleon really many politicians are, and Schiff in particular has proven to be. He recognized that what we saw on the streets last summer represented a generational upheaval, right? He, like many other politicians, wanted to not try to get in the way of that tsunami of popular sentiment, but to try to ride that wave some. And so, yes, he pulled back his support for Jackie Lacey, who had a strong law and order, tough on crime record, and was very much opposed by people like Melina Abdullah, Black Lives Matter, LA, lots of on-the-ground activists, LA Can, a lot of on-the-ground activists. So he played the smart political card and game definitely to that extent, but he showed that his heart wasn't really with it when he did not support the reform candidate. Okay, you recognize that Jackie Lacey's policies are so toxic that Black women, which is basically mostly what Black Lives Matter consists of, the leaders, it's a leader-full movement. So, and a lot of those activists who are leading it are Black women. And so recognizing that Black women, you know, were stepping forward and saying that's too much, you know, of a punitive approach, rather than saying, I hear them, let me get behind the other candidate who is talking about real reform. And Gascon, however skeptical you might have been about him coming in initially, when he laid out those directives, and those directives hurt enough for the DAs to have to try to sue for injunctions to stop them, there's a real pitched battle going on. There's a real pitched battle over whose conception of justice is going to prevail here. And Adam Schiff had an opportunity to get behind the conception of justice that the voters have gotten behind, that a lot of civil rights leaders are getting behind more and more, and that a lot of activists are getting behind. But instead, he played it safe. And that kind of shows you, again, I think what his instincts are. We need bold leadership in the Attorney General's office, and the governor can signal that he stands behind boldness in this area by getting somebody other than Adam Schiff in this position.
All right, so I'm going to hold you to it, because whenever we show up here and talk about this much bad stuff about one possible option, we got to offer some alternatives. So what are the qualities, the qualifications that you are looking for in California's next Attorney General? And do you have any suggestions, any other candidates who you think would be better for the job?
Well, you know, there are names that have been bandied, and I don't want to, you know, necessarily shout out any particular name at this point. I would say what we have to look at for above all is consistency and commitment to something other than a carceral approach to our social problem, right? We, for so long, decided that we were going to do poverty governance through the criminal justice system. And now we have an opportunity to do something different. And there are people, we can look at their records. We can see where they've really come down over time and really let the records speak for themselves, because that's what the protesters and marchers and activists in the street over the summer showed us. They showed us that we are capable and willing and will remain focused on policy, substantive policy. Jackie Lacey tried to play the representational politics game of saying, I'm a black woman, the first black woman DA of LA. I'm a woman DA. Those were her first 2 bullet points on some of her campaign literature. And Black Lives Matter and their allies and the voters of LA said, no, we're seeing beyond that kind of identity marker to the substance of your policies. And we see the substance of Gascon's policies are superior to yours from the standpoint of the shift we're trying to make away from retribution, retaliation, revenge, toward restoration, redemption, and rehabilitation. And so we can look at their records of the other people who are in consideration and see which ones really look like their hearts are in it.
Professor Armour, that is an excellent framework. I'm going to let you go in a second, but before I do, I have to ask you, your house behind you, is it in fact the most glorious place to throw a party in Los Angeles? Is that bar the dopest bar in Los Angeles? Like, what is going on here? Does Room Raider Twitter know how good things are in your house, and what is on your bookshelves?
Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. I came along here at a time when the guy was ready to move this place, and I've had a lot of functions over here with, art and justice stuff that I do. The irony is that everyone in the neighborhood I live in, View Park, everyone on Kenway in 1956 signed covenants not to sell to blacks or Jews, right? In 1956. And so now I hope that those bones are turning in the graves, as I have a lot of multicultural, ethnic kind of people up here all the time.
Well, here you are. You virtually invited a Jew into your home today. Happy to be there and to break those covenants with you.
Right on. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Professor Armour, I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you for having me.
So in coming weeks, California Governor Gavin Newsom is going to fill this role. He's going to select the state's next attorney general. And as you just heard, his choice is going to have massive implications for a justice system, or a legal system, let's call it, that incarcerates more people than any state not named Texas. Although Representative Adam Schiff is one of the more high-profile names being floated to fill this high-profile role, that doesn't mean he's right for the job. Schiff was in many ways an architect of tough-on-crime legislation that took place during his time in the state legislature, and has been directly responsible for a number of bills that made California's legal system more punitive, disproportionately harming Black and brown Californians and low-income Californians. So as a congressman, as we just heard from Professor Armour, it doesn't seem that Schiff has demonstrated a profound change away from that tough-on-crime agenda. The views of Californians, on the other hand, have moved away a lot from that tough-on-crime agenda. So while Adam Schiff may have stayed the same, his state has moved forward without him. California's next attorney general's got to be there with the people of California. Has to be ready to lead the California of today, not the California of 2 decades ago. So perhaps there are better choices than Adam Schiff for Governor Newsom to consider. Perhaps there's better agents of the legal system, the constantly evolving and perhaps transformative future that California's legal system could hold. 40 million people will be impacted by this decision. And it's on California Governor Gavin Newsom to have the courage to make this decision well. So you can join us anytime here on The Appeal Live. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Always glad to have you. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you next time.